Hello, my name is Chris Kempis. I'm a physical biologist and professor at the Santa Fe Institute, and welcome to this course on the origins of life. How life originated is one of the most interesting, complicated, difficult, and still open questions in modern science. And throughout this course, we're going to introduce you to why it's such a tricky question, and all the different ways that people are trying to solve this unanswered question. Since the time of Darwin, we've come to understand how life progresses, changes, diversifies, finds new niches, evolves greater complexity, and yet we still don't understand how to take that back to the original formation and initiation and origin of life. So, in saying that, it's important to recognize that life lives on a spectrum, and that spectrum goes from a completely abiotic world all the way up to multicellular creatures like us and entire societies. And at some point along this trajectory, we have this transition to something that we would call life. And so how is it that we go from this abiotic world to a biotic world, understanding that this is all part of one evolutionary continuum? So why is that question so challenging? Well, one of the things that makes it challenging is that it requires a lot of diverse types of knowledge to begin to understand this process and to answer this question. And so those types of knowledge draw from a variety of different disciplines, traditional disciplines. So for example, we need to understand something about earth science, biology, chemistry, and physics, and how all of these different concept areas intersect with one another and help us to understand exactly what happened when life first formed. And throughout this course, we will introduce you to the main questions in each of these concept areas and how they relate to the origins of life. And we will also start to begin to paint a picture of where the intersection and synthesis of these different concepts live, hopefully moving towards a better theory of how life started and evolved into greater complexity. So within these concept areas, what are the main questions? So if we take earth science as a concept area, the main questions as they relate to the origins of life tend to be things like, what was the environment like during the time when life originated? So we understand that the early earth was very different than the modern earth, and we need to understand something about what chemistry was possible then, and how that might come together to help life form in the first place. Another question is, in this early Earth, what was the diversity and complexity of various microenvironments? So if we think about the early Earth not only as a different average chemical space than what we currently have, but also lots of different unique types of microenvironments existing in this very different planetary environment, which of those microenvironments were most likely to give us life in the first place, or to have the right type of chemical complexity to at least start down that trajectory towards a living organism. And then another very interesting question is, once you get life in the first place, once you get early life, how does it and this geosphere, this environment, start to co-evolve? So we understand in the modern Earth how life interacts with the overall planetary system. We understand through lots of the history of life how life interacts, has a large feedback with, and modifies the geological environment and the geosphere. And the question is, when life first started, what did that feedback look like, and what did this coevolution how did this coevolution happen, and how important was that for the specific trajectory that life took once it was formed? From a biological perspective, the questions we're interested in are mostly, how do we take everything we know about modern life and try and look as far back in time as we can? So how do we wind back the clock on modern life to understand what early life might have looked like? So this involves taking a lot of phylogenetic or genetic perspectives to look back in time. It also involves asking questions like, what does the composition, structure, and function of modern life tell us about life's origin? Another way to say all of this is, which aspects of modern life are general and which are arbitrary? So what are the features that we see in modern life that are really essential to life through any origin and trajectory, and which are contingent on the particular evolutionary history that we happen to have seen for more recent life? Also in that vein, how do we take everything we know about modern evolutionary theory and start to apply that to things like proto-life, which might have a much less formal version of inheritance or genetics? How can we use evolutionary theory to think about the simplest and early life, which might be radically different, but also is almost certainly undergoing some sort of evolutionary process? From a chemical perspective, our main interest is how does life arise from the huge space of chemical reactions and compounds. So we understand that chemistry gives us this really vast set of possibilities, this really rich high-dimensional space, which is great for allowing something like life to form, but it makes it very complicated to understand exactly what combinations and processes and trajectories were actually necessary or were the ones that led to the life that we have. Another question which relates back to earth science is, what was early living chemistry like? How was that possible in the early earth? And how do we start to define sort of living chemistry that isn't quite yet life? And then a really interesting question is, how do we go from complicated chemistry or a complicated chemical environment to something that's even more complicated and complex, and that's the simplest cells. So even the simplest cells have a set of chemistry and feedback and dynamics and interconnections that is much more complicated than things that we see in the environment. And so how do we make that transition? Finally, from a physical perspective, the questions we're interested in are, how do physical constraints, for example, the laws of thermodynamics, start to constrain or bound the possibilities for life? So how do we take everything we know about physics and use that to say what is and isn't possible for life, especially as it first forms? Another question is really to ask, what can we take from what we know about which processes are easy and hard in physics without any biology to help us understand what might have happened for life in the first place. So for example, we understand that in purely physical systems, it's possible to get very rich pattern formation and dynamics. And so how important are those sorts of naturally emergent occurring phenomena to thinking about the first formation of life, and how do we start to apply some of those concepts of emergence and simple pattern formation to interact with how life began in the first place. Another final question that physics, or final set of ideas that physics can lend to us, is how do we take everything we know about physical concepts, physical laws, and start to generalize those to use them in a biological way. So how do we port physical concepts over to biology in general, and in particular, how do we port those ideas over to the origins of life? So as you can see, this is a very rich set of questions coming out of a variety of concept spaces across a huge range of science. And in this course, we've gathered people from this wide diversity of scientific perspectives to really lay out the details of each of these questions in specific ways, and then bring those details together in a way that we have a broader and more complete understanding of how life might have formed in the first place. And we certainly hope that you enjoy that trajectory and this course overall. So thank you.